You're listening to the Rethreading Madness podcast, which airs live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We are recorded and produced on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to our show.
I've never been further, knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox.
And I'm Glenn Grigg.
And we're here with Bethany Lindsay, a reporter from CBC, who did an in-depth report over several months on a story that has revealed some concerns around the College of Psychologists holding their membership accountable for their clients. Bethany has a decade worth of experience in BC journalism with a focus on courts, health, and social justice issues, including human rights. But today, we want to ask her about these concerns around the College of Psychologists, keeping clients aware about investigations, complaints, decisions, and those who may have done harmful things to their clients. So, Bethany, I just want to start by quoting something that you said. It was in April of 2019. It was an article that you wrote, and it said, "A culture of secrecy and a lack of focus on the public interest are at the heart of an explosive report by Harry Caton." Can you tell us a little bit about who Caton is and what was he doing that led to this statement?
Right. So Harry Caton is an international expert in professional regulation. He comes from the UK, and the BC government hired him to do this big review of health professional regulation in BC and how well it's working out. He was actually brought in because of some concerns that were happening at the College of Dental Surgeons about how they were handling complaints, how the registrar was treating people. But the government decided to kind of expand from that and look at health regulation overall and say, you know, what do you think needs to change about the system?
So they had Caton
come in and do an independent review, and he looked at the whole system, talked to people from most of the professional colleges in BC that deal with health. And he came up with this report that kind of, it was a bombshell, really, because a lot of the time you see these independent reviews and they say, oh, you know, things are working fine, fiddle with this or that here, room for improvement. But what Caton said was, okay, you could maybe go in and improve it, but that's not going to solve the problems. What you need to do is rip up the entire Health Professions Act,
wow,
which decides how BC governs the health professions, and start over again from scratch, because there are so many problems with it that a few amendments just aren't going to do the trick.
Wow.
Yeah.
Part of what you said was that, or it's in the report, perhaps, that there was a lack of transparency, that things were fragmented, that they were failing to put patients first. And so as somebody who is a mental health consumer, and I work and advocate for mental health consumers, I get a little frightened by that concept that, and I start to wonder who is putting mental health consumers first. So is there anybody that you have found doing these reports that is doing that? And maybe Glenn could chime in as well. So,
you know, it's the way things work right now in BC is the actual law does limit the colleges on how much they can make public. So if there's a complaint against a psychologist or some other health professional, they can do an investigation, sign an agreement, or go to a disciplinary hearing. But the outcomes of this and what the complaint was about is only ever posted if it's deemed a serious matter. And that's kind of broadly defined, or not too specifically defined. It has to meet a strict set of criteria that aren't exactly clear. So a lot of the time you will have health professionals who've been investigated, who the colleges have found that they've done something wrong, and they might say, okay, I agree, I screwed up. I'll take some, supplemental training. I'll consult with a supervisor, that sort of thing. And it's just never made public. Nothing about it. And you have no way of knowing how many times that has happened with a single health professional.
And doesn't it just keep listing on the college? Because I tried to go on there today, and it was a very short list. It didn't seem to go... I mean, it's not possible that that's all of them. So I'm wondering, maybe there's a time to factor in that at a certain point the complaints drop off?
I think some of the colleges maybe have a limit of about 10 years. I don't know for sure whether that's set in the legislation anywhere, but yeah. And some of the colleges, you'll find almost nothing. And they also make it very hard to find what complaints have been deemed serious matters.
Yeah, there's no search engine as far as I can tell.
It depends on the college.
Oh, well, College of Psychologists don't have a search engine if you're looking for the person that you're intending to go and see. So,
I'm going to chime in and because we're really talking here about several issues that I think really need to be underlined. One is we're talking about whose interest. And you asked the question, Bernadine, who's standing up for the interest of mental health consumers in British Columbia? And one of the problems that the counseling associations have in BC is, first of all, anybody can call themselves a therapist. The people who are members of those associations that also have a code of ethics and a standard of practice and a complaints process have stepped up to make themselves accountable to that. If there's no way to keep them accountable to that, they can resign at any point.
Well, it seems that at the College of Psychologists you can do the same thing, because this is what Dr. Posthuma, Posthuma
Yeah.
Well,
did.
I'm going to circle back to that one because it's an important one to get to. But what the Federation of Associations of Counseling Therapists in BC have done is just what you talked about. We said, this looks like self-interest when we step up. So the Federation has, number one, is that their interest is the public, and the interest is to serve the public by getting legislative regulation for counseling in BC in place.
When you say the Federation, you're talking about FACT BC?
We're talking about FACT BC. And so it's such an important conversation because Harry Caton went to the same place that FACT BC went to and said the people who are on these boards are elected from the professions. And so the experience of doing that is, oh my goodness, I'm here in a room full of other members of my profession with the interest of my profession in mind. It's very difficult for them to make the shift from, I might be a dentist, but I'm not here for the dentist. I'm here for the patients of the dentist and also for the trust of the public at large.
Right.
And so one of the things Caton said was we really, really need to think this election of boards. We need to find qualified people and make those boards appointed. That was one of his specific recommendations. But what's behind that is thinking clearly about interests. Whose interest do you have in mind? Are you serving the public? And fundamental to any effective college is that everything they do should be in the public interest.
Well, didn't they have to do that with the police a decade or more back, where it became clear that the police were investigating their own, and so they had to have an independent arm's length group that then turned around and looked at complaints. And it doesn't sound like the college has done that, although I do think they have public people on their complaint process board or something. I don't know what it's called, but...
Well, right now under the Health Professions Act, 1/3 of any board is public appointees, and that's intended to keep that public interest front and center.
Right.
But in some jurisdictions, they said we need to go to 50-50. And in the Caton report that Bethany was referring to, he said we need to go 100% public interest.
100% and arm's length. I would imagine, right? So that you don't have the wife of a person on the board or somebody who there's not an invested interest in making sure the status quo remains the status quo.
Right. And there, I think an interesting example of that is some stuff that I covered at the Chiropractors College, where there were 3 members of the board who were posting all sorts of anti-vaccination stuff online, which is strictly against college policy. Chiropractors aren't trained in immunization or infectious diseases. And these 3 members of the board, including the vice chair, were posting all this stuff on Facebook, on their websites, saying vaccinations are harmful, you should just eat fruit, stuff like that. And there were people complaining for months about this. And as it happened, one of these guys who was on the board, the vice chair, was also on the inquiry committee, which investigates complaints. And so it was only after I reported on this fact, but as it turned out, in this case, it was another case of a professional association stepping up. So the Chiropractic Association, which is, just a voluntary membership, they have no regulatory power, but they had been sending complaints to the college and to the Ministry of Health for months and even a year, saying something needs to be done about this. This is not in the public interest. And finally, when we were able to report on that, the vice chair who was posting this stuff stepped down. They cleaned up the board.
That's good.
But you can't run a regulatory system by waiting for media to expose something.
Right. Although sometimes that's how things run, unfortunately.
In fact, if I can step in with more ideas, one of the things that FACT-BC has talked about in how to conduct a college is that so often what happens is that the college takes action based on the existence of a complaint. And sometimes there are constraints about who can complain because you don't want to hear from third parties necessarily. They may have some commercial interest in damaging a reputation or something like that. So the better regimens that I've seen involve things like what we have in Quebec, where they have a lottery. And they pull out in the case of counseling therapists in Quebec, they pull out 10% and they have an audit team. And the audit team goes through their practice. And it's just a random selection. And what we know in almost every profession, almost every industry, that the best estimates I've seen are that it's 8 to 10 times more efficient and effective to do preventative programs like that rather than to wait for the complaints to happen. And part of it is, just as Bethany led with, when you do a practice audit, you're going to see the patterns. And when you get a complaint, you're authorized to look into that incident, and then something has to come up about it. That's just one example of many, many things that need to be done in the area of quality assurance, because once the harm is done, I think it's fair to say regulation has failed.
I think
regulation at its best should prevent harm.
Absolutely. And I think the other part of that from the mental health consumer's perspective, is that what we're finding is people don't know what the ethical boundaries are, and they don't know what's okay or not okay in therapy. So they don't know they should be complaining about this person because this person who's their therapist told them, you're just too crazy, you're just too anxious, you're just too this, you're just too that. So there really needs to be a recognition that we're dealing with a vulnerable population, right, and that extra steps need to be taken. And we're here with Bethany Lindsay having a great conversation about how to ensure that mental health consumers are kept safe given colleges and regulatory bodies and everything. And Glenn, you had a question.
Well, we were just talking about the importance of doing a thorough investigation when there's a complaint. And then we even backed up from that point and we said, why wait for a complaint? How about a system that makes sure that quality assurance is in place, that identifies potential harm and shuts it down before it happens? Because when you're asking for colleges to only act on complaints, you're also saying that consumers of any healthcare service should be experts in the standard of practice in that service. And that's just not factual, and it's not fair.
No.
Yeah, and that is something that happened in the Alan Postuma case. So this is a psychologist who's testified in hundreds of family court matters, doing psychological assessments for child custody battles. And he's had at least 10 complaints against him over the years. And the most recent investigation into his work was prompted by a mother whose family had been assessed during a child custody hearing. And she'd lost custody of her son based largely on Postuma's report. So she filed a complaint, and it was very detailed. It laid out all sorts of allegations. And the college looked into all of it, and they went through her allegations one by one, and they said some of them didn't make sense. They didn't understand what she was saying. There was no way to prove this allegation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they came out at the end, and they said, we found that none of these allegations are provable or have any basis. But then they stopped and said, okay, this is a guy who we found several questionable practices with. So they just said, we're going to bring in an outside psychologist and see if she can go through the assessment process and figure out for herself whether there were any standards in the code of conduct that were broken. And when she was able to go through, knowing what the rules are and what the expectations are, she found some serious breaches or alleged breaches of the code of conduct.
So this is an assessor not to go over the report he made for court, but to go over the complaint that she made.
She went over the assessment that he'd done for court.
Okay.
Yeah, because the college had already gone through her complaint and said, no, they didn't uphold any of her allegations. So this other psychologist came in, went through Postuma's assessment again, and said, no, there are serious issues. And so it was great that they did that, and they recognized in the complaint investigation report that I saw, they said, this person, she's a lay person. How is she supposed to know?
Right.
But I have no evidence of how often that happens, and I would not suspect that it's a frequent thing.
I think also partly what happens for mental health consumers is not only do they not know what the boundaries are, the rules, or the standard of practice, but they don't know the language. And so they'll say something and they might, make it vague or unclear or, use the wrong words that end up discrediting them, as opposed to somebody else who does know the language and does know how to navigate all that stuff and knows how to put the words together in a sentence that doesn't discredit them. And so it gets complicated. And unfortunately, I think mental health consumers end up on the bad end of that. Can you tell us, I know that you talked to several of the people who this happened to, and how did it impact them? Where did it leave them to have gone through this with him?
Yeah, not in a great place. Some of them have went into the process of the psychological assessment with Postuma having custody of their kids, and came out without custody, despite credible documented examples of violence by their ex-partner. So I know one case where the mother is just terrified that her son is going to come to serious harm.
Wow.
Other cases, these are expensive, right? They can cost anywhere to do one of these assessments from about $8,000 to $30,000.
Wow.
And that's on top of, the lawyer's fees and all the stuff you're paying for in family court. And so these people are just broke. So I talked to one dad who, after going through this process, after Posthuma recommended against him, after paying for all these court fees, lawyer fees, he was just broke and depressed. And when his ex-wife asked him, will you sign away all parental rights to your children? He agreed. And he'll never have a chance to get that back now.
And so the fees for Posthuma, is that both parties are responsible for that, or one person?
Yeah, it depends. Some cases I've seen it's been one party who's paid for it.
Okay.
Others, they've split it. I've seen cases where the Ministry of Children and Family Development actually steps in and they ask for these assessments, and so the ministry pays.
Right, okay.
And I have seen a lot of cases where Posthuma gave people courtesy discounts, which was one reason why they chose him.
Right.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah. So if this guy was still practicing, what would alert sort of a regular run-of-the-mill person going into family court that he might be problematic for them?
Well, I mean, if he hadn't gone through this process and agreed to retire, then and the complaints hadn't been largely successful to the extent that we could call them successful, there would be no notice on his profile on the College of Psychologists website, no record of these complaints. And so the people involved would have to be very savvy about the courts, and they could search Canley, which is an online resource that has all sorts of court decisions, and they would find all sorts of cases where judges had questioned Posthuma's work, but not many people, like the regular person, doesn't know about Canley.
No, I do, but I don't think I'm regular.
Well, yeah, you host the show.
just for, but I will put that link on our website so people can find it.
Yeah.
And I mean,
That's
it's got
great.
a search engine, and it's not that difficult to use as a search engine.
And I'm going to chime in to
Yes.
comment that we're back to the old question of interest as well. I was working with the BC Association of Clinical Counselors under the old Family Law Act. We have a new Family Law Act in BC that has significantly improved the situation. But we were pioneers in saying if there are warring parties, whenever a professional steps in and you get a decision you don't like, it just attracts complaints. And so the complaints may be serious, but they're also discounted because they're attributed to the context. So one of the changes that we made was when members of the BC Association of Clinical Counselors were doing that kind of work, is that you don't work for either aggrieved party. The client is the court, and you're a servant of the court, and that there were very detailed standards set out for what the assessments were going to be, and the requirement was that you put those standards out front so that anybody can look them up. These are the kinds of things that need to happen when there's really effective quality assurance going on in any regulatory regime.
So that's the BCACC? Is that what you're saying? I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused.
The BC Association of Clinical Counselors, when they looked into those kinds of reports, looked into not just the content of the report and the qualification of who's doing it, but whose interest is being served and who's the client.
Right. Okay. Yes. Absolutely.
One of the things that's being recommended right now, or that will be recommended soon by certain women's groups who look into this sort of thing, is a requirement in all family law cases that if one of these assessments is going to be ordered, there has to be a hearing where there is disclosure of the professional's past, which would be a huge help. Yeah.
Wow. And how far has that gotten? Has it?
It's floating in the air. It hasn't gotten anywhere.
So who would put on the hearing? Is that the court or?
Yeah, it would be, the idea, as I understand it, would be that it would be like a mandatory step.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically to ensure that the professional doing the assessment can deliver something that is to the standard that a court can use as evidence.
And that the people involved have fully informed consent.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that was part of what was talked about in the Caton report, is that if people don't know that there has been previous complaints for a professional, then there really isn't informed consent.
No, absolutely
No.
not. It's a big problem. Informed consent is one of the pillars of ethical healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know were you able to assess how often a settlement agreement happened that allowed somebody to quietly accept some kind of changes to their practice? And
I wish I knew.
Okay.
I don't know.
You don't know.
I do know that all the colleges in BC that deal with health professionals do prefer to do some sort of settlement rather than going through a disciplinary hearing.
Right.
And, in some cases, those settlements or consent agreements will be made public. But the colleges always prefer to go to something by consent. I think it's a matter of resources, money, time. It's just easier for everybody.
Yeah, courts like consent agreements as well. And I think one of the things the College of Psychologists said is that they have a more certain outcome, which as a mental health consumer advocate makes me wonder, is the complainant ever involved in the outcome? Do they get any say in the outcome and whether or not it's reasonable?
No say whatsoever. In these cases, at least that I've seen, the complainant only knows that an agreement has been reached because they get a notification from the college, they get an outline of what it is, and then they're told, if you disagree with this, you can review to the Health Professions Review Board, which tends towards just upholding what the colleges have found.
Wow.
There is an alternative practice that I'm very interested in, which is something called restorative practice or restorative justice. And the premise there is that when the professional has made a mistake and made an error, provided that everyone agrees that a mistake has been made, then everyone who's involved gets together, and the purpose of the process is not to punish anybody, but to acknowledge that there's been a harm done and to restore the harm.
That actually sounds like a First Nations model.
I think one of the things we find is that First Nations and Aboriginal communities are completely comfortable with this. The RCMP has gone to this in their dealings with First Nations. But I want to go further and say that it comes back to the very reason why we have professional regulation is the risk of harm. And so if a harm has occurred and I complain about it, and I'm just left with my harm and have no voice in the process, and nobody steps in for any kind of restoration,
right,
then the trust is damaged ongoingly.
Yeah.
And we need that as a community.
Yeah. Caton also suggested that any professional should never be allowed to retire in the face of a disciplinary hearing and as somebody who's had that happen to me, that kind of grabbed my attention. Why do you suppose this is allowed?
So what the College of Psychologists has told me about this is that pretty much the harshest punishment that they can impose on somebody is to take away their registration. So if somebody retires, gives up their registration, then that's their job done. It's easy. These colleges tend to be pretty underfunded and under-resourced. But when I talked to Harry Caton recently, he said, one of the big problems with this is that somebody can just retire or give up their registration and pop up in a different province and re-register and start over again.
Is that still possible? I thought they I thought they put they closed the door on that, or was that just for psychiatrists? But I'm sure he knows, right?
I have the greatest respect for Harry Caton.
Yep.
Most of his experience is in places like the UK and Australia, where the registrations are federal. I'm not the world's greatest expert, but I have not seen any exceptions to the idea that, first of all, you have to declare that you have no unresolved professional issues when you seek a registration. And secondly, that if you lie on an application, any falsehood on an application is grounds for losing your license again. So that's one of the safeguards that's in place for that.
It's interesting that they would lose their license for that, but not for harming a client. I mean, I'm sorry, but I'm just sitting here going, are you kidding me?
In this case, of course, though, the complaint is considered resolved.
Right.
So
we have to take a short break. Sorry. We'll be right back. And we're talking with Bethany Lindsay, a reporter at CBC, who did an incredible report on a story that has revealed some loopholes in the College of Psychologists to hold their membership accountable. Glenn, you wanted to talk a little bit more about the fact that the college is under-resourced.
I do. I want to talk about that. I want to begin by saying that if someone resigns in the face of a complaint, that complaint should be considered by all regulators, including the college from which they came, as unresolved, because it's a standard that you can't register with another profession if you have an unresolved complaint. So a resignation should not be the equivalent of a resolution, and it just shouldn't happen, and I'm containing a certain level of outrage. And it's
you don't have to do that, by the way. We're okay with you being completely outraged.
Well, and I'm speaking as someone who has spent late nights poring over budget sheets for boards and associations, and the idea that a self-funding college doesn't have the resources to protect the public when that's what they promise to do, then you have two choices, I would say, and they're very straightforward. You raise the fees and get the job done, or you change your policies to work more effectively with the dollars you have. And that means doing a lot more preventative work and being a lot more appropriately intrusive into monitoring whether practice standards and codes of ethics are being maintained.
It does seem to me that if they're not actually disciplining and making people accountable, then they're basically giving them permission to go and do it again. And the other thing I want to say in this is that somebody resigning as a psychologist in the province of BC does not mean you can't put up a shingle and go keep working. There's just nothing that stops people from doing that.
Exactly what I was going to say. Without regulation of counseling, Alan Postuma could pop up tomorrow offering counseling out of his home, out of his office. And, we've got several kind of professions in BC where we've got a regulated profession sitting beside an unregulated occupation. And so, we had an example this year, or it might have been last year, I'm losing track of time, where there was a naturopath she was famous for providing a little boy with a homeopathic serum made from rabid dogs' saliva. And she had made some ridiculous claims about being able to cure autism. And what happened with her, and Harry Caton pointed this out in her report, is she was allowed to just give up her registration without any official findings of wrongdoing. And, I talked to her that day, and she said, now I'm just a homeopath. I'm not going to change anything about what I do, but I just don't have to abide by the rules of the college anymore.
Yep, that's BC. There you go. So we were talking earlier, Glenn, before we got on the radio, about the Caton report, and you were talking about, I wanted to know, the BC government, what did this do to the BC government in terms of setting up the regulatory body that you're trying to do with FACT BC? How did it impact it? Did it impact it? And what now?
Well, as as we talked about before, in the Caton report, what he said was that you could try to amend the current Health Professions Act, but you would be better served to just start over again, because you need to start from certain really fundamental premises like whose interests do you serve. And for the last 25 years, government has been saying, it's absolutely essential that we regulate counseling. It's unsafe and it's unfair not to do so. And so we'll get past this hurdle, or we'll get past that hurdle, and then we'll get back to you and then we'll do it. And it doesn't happen. Right now, FACT-BC, just like all the other colleges, from what I hear, has been told nothing about what direction the House committee, that's the BC Legislature's committee, is going to go on this issue.
On the Caton report,
On the Caton report. But our biggest concern, it will be another of, we're going to leave the public at risk, and we want you to wait before you get this done. And of course, if the question is, how do you regulate and who should be talking about it, counselors have a lot to contribute to that. They're fully ready to go and should be at that table talking about how to be part of healthcare reform and bringing some new ideas and fresh blood onto the fresh blood. That's the wrong metaphor, but you know what I mean. The fresh ideas.
Fresh ideas. What table? You mentioned they should be at the table. What table? Is there a table happening?
Well, the table has to be that the existing colleges need to get together, because there will be some parameters set, and one of them has already been suggested, that we have 22 colleges in British Columbia, that we could have fewer colleges, because we sort of have one college, one title. We could have fewer colleges and many titles under every college.
Okay.
That's a reasonable way to go. That needs to be organized so that it's always in the public interest, and I suggest better policy is to say we need to be preventing the harms before they happen.
Yes, let's do that. You also were talking about FACT-BC, and that you've already set up, I'm going to say the wrong word, I'm sure, as a regulatory college, you would have a code of conduct and bylaws and how you operate and everything. And what you were saying was that your system already incorporates all of Caton's suggestions.
Yeah, we looked through the Caton report, and the one thing we had been saying was that we wanted a college of counseling therapists. And in response to the Caton report, we said, we want the title counseling therapist protected under the Health Professions Act. How you do that, as long as it's fair, it follows due process, and serves the public interest, we're happy with that. Other than that, we found that all of our processes and our recommended policies and procedures were in line with what Caton was talking about. So we're completely comfortable with that report.
So then how, if I was to ask you, given what you've written, not that it's in place yet, but what you've written, how does the client get protected?
Well, what we're suggesting would happen for a protected title like counseling therapist is, first of all, that there would be standards of practice and a code of ethics, and that everyone would get clinical supervision, and that clinical supervisors would be reporting back to the board to a standard, and that there would be audits and practice audits, that there would be an option for restorative processes when there were complaints, and that it would be mandatory that when you gained knowledge of another co-professional who was not meeting the standard or abiding by the code, that you would be required to report on that. Those are all things.
Mandatory reporting?
It's what you have to do. And it comes back to the point we were making before, that somebody else can be thinking, dentistry is an obvious example. Extracting that tooth was a great idea. It's only another professional who's going to be able to spot that. And so there has to be special responsibility for the professionals in the field to be watching out for each other, and not in a spying kind of way, but in a really supportive way. We're in this field to help people, and we want to do our best helping. And so it's required that you come up with the support for your colleagues. If that doesn't work, then you have to report, because we have to put clients and patients first.
Would you be able to take a report from a client warning you about another client that's being harmed?
I think that has to be a standard of practice that people very often in so many healthcare situations, they happen behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And so when a healthcare professional hears about negligence or malpractice from another healthcare profession, they need to follow that up. It needs to be in the code.
And I'd say one thing that would be helpful for me as a journalist, so this is kind of a selfish thing, is for professionals to not be restricted from speaking out publicly about problems that they're seeing from other colleagues. So, when I report on a problem in a certain profession, I don't want to pick on chiropractors and naturopaths, but I've just done a lot of stuff, about anti-vaccination stuff among these professionals. I know that the majority of the people who do these professions do not share those views. They don't believe that you can use chiropractic to treat autism, for example, but they can't speak out because they'll be disciplined for that. And that's that. I don't think that does any good for the profession itself, because the public perception is that everybody feels the same way as the person who's marketing bogus treatments.
Yeah, and that's what you're talking about. You're talking about one professional being able to hold another professional in terms of a complaint to some
I'm talking
kind of
about making it public.
Oh, making it public. Okay,
And
I get it. But if there's a public system for complaints, and I'm sure that that's what you're talking about, because Caton said patients' right to know is paramount, which I wrote down here because I really believe that that's true. And so if that's happening, then the public part would be happening.
I think most ethicists who have thought about this situation have said, if I'm aware of a colleague not meeting a standard or violating a code of ethics, I need to speak up to that person right away. And if I don't get a satisfactory response, then I need to go to the authority who can make that happen. And if that response doesn't follow, then I have a duty to the public to take it a step higher. And along the way, I think we can reasonably expect that I'm going to make errors and everybody else in the profession is going to do that. I need to be open to hearing about my errors, owning up, and taking corrective action immediately.
I think that one of the biggest things that needs to happen is to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're protecting the people who are vulnerable, and that becomes our paramount goal and focus, is to make sure clients are kept safe. We need to stop here, unfortunately. Bethany, thank you so much for coming in.
Great to be here. This great discussion.
It was a great discussion. Thank you so much. And we're going to post links to your stories on our website.
Great.
And I will put the Ken Lee link on there, and I'll also put a link on to the Caton report for people who want to go and take a look at what that is. And I think it's 100 pages, isn't it? It's a big thing.
It's a surprisingly good read for the genre.
Yes. So, and to our listeners, if you have a story about how the college or any one of the colleges around here handled your complaints, drop us a line. Everything you say will be kept confidential. We just re-aired a 2019 interview with Bethany Lindsay, a CBC reporter on the Clayton Report. One might think that the state of registering therapists and counselors in BC to protect clients from unethical ones would have happened here already, but it has not. In October of 2022, just a few short months ago, BC did introduce the Health Professions and Occupations Act, and while it appears to be comprehensive, it continues to leave out the thousands of professionals who work in our mental health field and call themselves therapists or counselors. Here in BC, anyone, trained or not, can still hang up a shingle, call themselves a counselor, and start working with clients. The BC government has assured us that now that Bill 36, the Health Professions and Occupations Act, is complete, they will turn their attention to regulating the thousands of others who operate in our province as therapists in this field. However, this is not the first time this has been promised. In the meantime, BC clients continue to be hurt by untrained and unethical therapists with no recourse and no means of holding them accountable. Currently, associations and societies in BC provide professional memberships for therapists and counselors. All have something like a code of conduct to which their membership must make a commitment. The colleges that regulate our doctors, psychiatrists, and psychologists are all now covered under Bill 36. While the Act, in my opinion, has vague descriptions around the issue of exploitation, the colleges have their own standards of practice. And for instance, the one for doctors and psychiatrists have a zero tolerance for any type of sexual contact or behavior with clients. Why? Because the dramatic imbalance of power in therapy resembles that which is found in a parent and child relationship. With the vulnerable client in the child position, it makes full and informed consent basically impossible. However, some of these other associations allow therapists to enter into a sexual relationship with their client if 2 years has passed since the termination of therapy and other criteria exist around the depth and scope of the therapy that happened prior to termination. If they are eventually included under Bill 36, will they be allowed to maintain this different standard of practice, or will they be required to provide further assurances for client safety? In my opinion, and I must say I'm not sure if my co-host agrees with this or not, there is no means by which any association or society can filter out the unethical therapist in their roster. And unfortunately, those unethical therapists have easily manipulated around those variables in the standard of practice or their code of conducts to make it appear as if they are doing no wrong. In addition, the bylaws of the association give control around any inquiry into a therapist's inappropriate behavior to the unethical therapist themselves. I am sure it wasn't intended, but after a complaint is lodged, simply resigning their membership closes any investigation into their inappropriate and at times criminal behavior, leaving the client with no recourse and allowing the unethical counselor to remain unaccountable. Of note, resigning a membership does not disallow the unethical counselor from continuing their therapy practice. As mentioned, any person with or without training can hang up a shingle, call themselves a therapist in BC, and begin seeing clients. All in all, it is a system that is fraught with pitfalls for the clients. My thanks to Bethany Lindsay from CBC again for this important and still relevant interview about the Clayton Report, which informed BC in the development of Bill 36. Also to my co-host Glenn Gregg for his valuable input, and to Steve in the booth for his sound recording in the original interview. A shout out to Sherry Ulrich, Bill Henderson, Roy Forbes, and Joshua Bassett for the gift of their music, but as always, and most importantly, our thanks goes out to you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. I'm Bernadine Fox, and you've just listened to Rethreading Madness, the podcast that dares to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program or want to share your story or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. If you enjoyed this show, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.
I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright. Don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche, just words people say to be nice. Or someone